On a desolate station platform where hope comes to die, Sarah Winters shivers beneath the moonless prairie sky. Her dreams of a new life shattered, abandoned by the family who promised to make her their own. The letter in her trembling hands holds only rejection, the ink still fresh with cruel finality. But fate has a way of turning the darkest hours into dawn. As midnight approaches, the rhythmic clatter of hooves pierces the winter silence, bringing with it a black carriage and a man whose wealth is matched only by his compassion. In his eyes, she sees not pity but possibility. Could this chance encounter under starlight be more than mere coincidence? Could one man's kindness rewrite her story? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass carriage lantern cast dancing shadows across the platform's weathered boards, its warm glow a stark contrast to the bitter December night. Sarah clutched her carpet bag closer, her gloved fingers trembling not just from cold, but from the peculiar mix of fear and hope that stirred in her chest as the stranger's carriage drew to a halt before her. The man who stepped down moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command. Tall and broad-shouldered, he cut an imposing figure in his long black coat, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, keen and observant, yet touched with something that might have been kindness. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that spoke of old-world courtesy. His voice was deep and steady, like distant thunder across the prairie. "James Montgomery." He paused, taking in her situation with a quick, assessing glance. "I don't believe the next train is due until morning, and that's assuming it can make it through this weather." Sarah straightened her spine, summoning what dignity remained after 6 hours on this God-forsaken platform. "Sarah Winters, Mr. Montgomery." Her voice barely wavered. "And you're right about the train, though I confess I've nowhere for it to take me anymore." The letter crinkled in her pocket, a harsh reminder of how thoroughly her plans had crumbled. 6 months of correspondence, carefully saved teachers' wages spent on passage west, all undone by a few cruel lines. "Our son has made other arrangements. Your services will not be required." James Montgomery's expression darkened as she explained her situation, though his voice remained gentle. "The Harriston family," he shook his head slowly. "They've a reputation for such behavior, I'm afraid. Third time this year they've summoned a bride, only to turn her away. Some say they enjoy watching desperate women dance to their tune." Anger flickered across his features, quickly masked but unmistakable. He glanced at his carriage, then back to Sarah. "My ranch is 10 miles north. Mrs. Bennett, my housekeeper, keeps the guest rooms ready, and I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd accept shelter, at least until we can arrange something more permanent for you." Sarah hesitated. Every lesson in propriety screamed against accepting such an offer from a stranger, yet there was something in his manner that spoke of absolute trustworthiness. The wind cut through her coat like knives, making her decision suddenly, starkly clear. "You're very kind, Mr. Montgomery." She met his gaze directly. "I would be grateful for shelter tonight." He smiled then, a warm expression that transformed his entire face. "The kindness, Miss Winters, is in allowing me to help." He lifted her carpet bag with ease, then offered his arm. "Shall we?" The carriage's interior was blessedly warm, lined with plush velvet and what appeared to be bear fur. As James Montgomery helped her inside, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, pale face, auburn hair escaping its pins, eyes too large in her drawn face. She looked like what she was, a woman at the end of her rope, grasping at Providence. The carriage lurched forward, iron-bound wheels crunching through fresh snow. Through the window, Sarah watched the station's lone lantern fade into the darkness, taking with it the last vestiges of her old plans, her old life. "The ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, Montgomery said quietly, breaking the silence. "Though I admit it's grown considerably since my father's day. We run cattle primarily, but there's good horse stock too. And orchards when the weather permits." He paused, studying her face. "You mentioned you were a teacher." "Yes, in Vermont, for 6 years. The familiar topic helped steady her voice, though I suppose teaching posts are scarce out here." "On the contrary," something like hope kindled in his eyes. "The town's been desperate for a proper teacher. Most folk around here learned their letters from their mammas, if they learned them at all. A trained educator would be—" He trailed off, seeming to catch himself. "But that's a conversation for tomorrow, after you've rested." The carriage crested a hill, and suddenly the land opened up before them. In the starlight, Sarah could make out vast stretches of snow-covered pasture, split by dark lines of fence and the silver ribbon of a creek. And there, perhaps 2 miles distant, a cluster of lights burned warm against the darkness. The Montgomery ranch house. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch, Miss Winters." James Montgomery's voice carried a note of pride. "It's not much, but we call it home." Not much, Sarah thought, was a rather modest description for what was clearly the largest ranch she'd glimpsed since leaving Denver. But there was something in his tone, in the way he said "we," that spoke of a man who valued the people and purpose of a place over its mere size. The remaining miles passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional creak of leather. Sarah found her eyelids growing heavy, lulled by the carriage's gentle motion and the first real warmth she'd felt in hours. "Miss Winters?" Montgomery's voice was soft. "We're here." Sarah blinked awake to find the carriage had stopped before a sprawling 2-story house, its windows glowing with welcoming light. As James Montgomery helped her down, the front door opened, spilling more warmth and light into the snowy night. A woman stood in the doorway, grey-haired and sturdy, with an air of quiet capability about her. "Land's sakes, James, what poor soul have you rescued this time?" Her tone held more fondness than reproach. "Mrs. Bennet, may I present Miss Sarah Winters?" Montgomery's hand remained steady at Sarah's elbow as they climbed the porch steps. "She'll be our guest for a time." The housekeeper's shrewd eyes took in Sarah's travel-worn appearance and obvious exhaustion. "Well then, Miss Winters, let's get you settled. I've beef stew keeping warm, and your room's all ready." She shot James a knowing look. "The blue room, I think." As Sarah followed Mrs. Bennet into the house, she caught one last glimpse of James Montgomery standing in the doorway, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that this night had altered the course of both their lives in ways yet to be discovered. The heavy door swung shut against the winter wind, and Sarah Winters stepped fully into her new beginning. The ranch house's interior unfolded before Sarah like pages from a cherished novel. Rich mahogany wainscoting lined the walls, its deep gleam speaking of years of careful polishing. A broad staircase curved up to the second floor, while doorways opened onto rooms that managed to be both spacious and intimate, a feat Sarah had rarely seen achieved in the grander homes of Vermont. Mrs. Bennet moved through the house with the ease of long familiarity, leading Sarah past a formal dining room where an antique brass scale held pride of place on a sideboard. "Been in the Montgomery family for generations," the housekeeper explained, catching Sarah's admiring glance. "James's grandmother used it to weigh out spices and gold alike, or so the story goes. These days it mostly serves to remind us about balance and fair measure." Something in her tone suggested she meant more than mere weights and measures. The kitchen proved to be the heart of the house, warm, welcoming, and thoroughly modern despite its traditional appearance. A massive iron stove radiated heat, and copper pots hung in gleaming rows above a work island large enough to prepare food for a small army. "Sit yourself down, child." Mrs. Bennet gestured to a cushioned chair near the stove. "Let's get some hot food in you before anything else." She moved efficiently around the kitchen, ladling rich beef stew into a bowl and cutting thick slices from a fresh loaf of bread. "James doesn't usually bring strays home this late," she commented, setting the meal before Sarah. "But I'm glad he found you. That station's no place for anyone on a night like this." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm bowl, inhaling the savory aroma. "He seems very kind," she ventured, careful to keep her tone neutral. Mrs. Bennet's laugh was warm and knowing. "Kind, yes, but not soft. James Montgomery built this ranch into what it is today through hard work and good judgment. Speaking of which—" She broke off as boot steps sounded in the hallway. James appeared in the doorway, having shed his heavy coat. Without it, Sarah could better appreciate the quiet strength of his bearing. His shirt was fine cotton, his vest, well cut but not flashy. Here was a man, she thought, who wore his prosperity with the same natural grace as he did his authority. "I've had word from the bunkhouse," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Bennet. "Pete and the boys got all the cattle moved to the sheltered pastures before the worst of the weather hit." He settled into a chair across from Sarah, his movements containing that same measured quality she'd noticed before. "Miss Winters, I hope you'll forgive my presumption, but I've asked Mrs. Bennet to prepare the blue room for you. It has a fine view of the sunrise when the weather permits." The blue room, Sarah would soon discover, was a spacious chamber on the second floor, decorated in shades of azure and cream. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, while a sitting area with a small writing desk occupied a bay window. But that would come later. For now, she simply nodded her thanks, too focused on maintaining her composure to trust her voice. "You'll want to meet some of the ranch hands tomorrow," James continued, seeming to understand her need to focus on practical matters. "Pete's been my foreman for 15 years, knows more about cattle than any man west of the Mississippi. Then there's young Tom, who handles the horses, and Maria in the garden. She grows vegetables that make Denver's finest restaurants jealous." "It sounds like quite an operation," Sarah managed, impressed despite her exhaustion. "We manage." James's modesty couldn't quite hide his pride. "Though truth be told, we could use someone with a head for numbers. The ranch has grown faster than our bookkeeping skills." He paused, studying her with those keen eyes. "But that's a conversation for another time. You must be tired." As if his words had given permission, exhaustion swept over Sarah in an overwhelming wave. Mrs. Bennet clearly noticed, for she was suddenly at Sarah's elbow, helping her to her feet. "Come along, dear. Your room's all ready, and things will look brighter in the morning." James stood as they prepared to leave the kitchen. "Miss Winters," he said softly, "I know this isn't what you planned when you came west, but perhaps it's where you were meant to be all along." Sarah carried those words with her as she followed Mrs. Bennet up the broad staircase. The housekeeper's touring commentary washed over her in a gentle stream, something about breakfast times and where to find extra blankets. But Sarah's mind was still in the kitchen, still caught in that moment when James Montgomery had suggested that this catastrophe might actually be Providence in disguise. The blue room proved to be everything James had promised and more. A fire already burned in the small grate, and the bed had been turned down, its linens crisp and inviting. Mrs. Bennet helped her with her boots and coat, clucking sympathetically over her travel-worn appearance. "There's a nightgown laid out in the dressing room," the housekeeper said, lighting a bedside lamp. "We keep a few things on hand for guests. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you properly settled." She paused at the door. "Sleep well, Miss Winters. You're safe here." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the bed's edge, finally allowing herself to process the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Less than 2 hours ago, she'd been standing on that desolate platform, every hope shattered. Now she sat in a room finer than any she'd ever occupied, under the protection of a man who seemed to have stepped from the pages of a romance novel. A sob caught in her throat, part relief, part lingering fear, part sheer overwhelming emotion. But as she changed for bed and slipped between the soft sheets, Sarah felt something else growing in her heart. A tentative, fragile hope. Perhaps James Montgomery was right. Perhaps this was exactly where she was meant to be. The last thing she noticed before sleep claimed her was the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantel, counting out the seconds of her new life in steady, reassuring beats. Dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold when Sarah woke. For a moment she lay still, orienting herself in the unfamiliar room. A small leather-bound journal caught her eye on the bedside table, placed there by Mrs. Bennet, no doubt, along with a fresh pencil. The thoughtful gesture brought tears to her eyes. Wrapping herself in the thick robe she found hanging by the fire, Sarah approached the bay window. The view took her breath away. Silver Creek Ranch spread out before her like an artist's masterpiece, rolling. Pastures, stands of pine, and in the distance, mountains touched with alpenglow. Near the house, smoke rose from what must be the bunkhouse chimney, and figures moved about the barn, beginning the day's work. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Miss Winters." Mrs. Bennet's voice carried through the door. "Breakfast will be served in half an hour, if you're feeling up to it." Sarah discovered a dress laid out in the dressing room. Simple, but well made, and blessedly clean after her travel-worn garments. It fit well enough to make her wonder if Mrs. Bennet had altered it during the night. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman transformed by rest and warmth, though anxiety still lingered in her eyes. The morning room where breakfast was served faced east, catching the full glory of the sunrise. James Montgomery already sat at the table, reading what appeared to be correspondence. He rose immediately upon her entrance, and Sarah noticed again that natural grace that seemed to characterize his every movement. "Miss Winters," he smiled, pulling out a chair for her. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you." Sarah settled into her seat, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Bennet. "Your home is beautiful. It's been in the family since my grandfather's." "A time," James said, resuming his seat, "though I admit it was considerably smaller then, just the central portion. We added the wings about 5 years ago." He paused, studying her face. "I hope you'll feel comfortable here for as long as you choose to stay." The implicit invitation in his words gave Sarah courage. Setting down her coffee cup, she met his gaze directly. "Mr. Montgomery, I feel I must be honest about my situation." He nodded, pushing aside his letters to give her his full attention. Sarah drew a deep breath and began her story. "I was a teacher in Vermont, at a small private school for girls. I loved my work, but—" She smiled wryly. "Teaching doesn't pay particularly well, and I found myself looking westward, dreaming of something more. When I saw the Harriston family's advertisement for a bride, it seemed like providence. They wanted someone educated, someone who could help manage their ranch and teach their younger children." James's expression darkened at the mention of the Harristons, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "We corresponded for 6 months. They seemed so eager, so welcoming. I sold everything I owned to pay for my passage west, and then—" She pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket, smoothing it on the tablecloth. "I arrived at the station yesterday afternoon, only to find this waiting for me." James picked up the letter, his jaw tightening as he read. "Contemptible," he muttered, "though not, I'm sorry to say, unexpected. The Harristons have something of a reputation for such schemes." "Schemes?" Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee. "They're land poor," James explained gently. "Been trying to sell their ranch for years, but no one will pay their asking price. So they've taken to other methods, advertising for brides, collecting their travel funds, then turning them away. I've heard of at least 2 others this year alone." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Then I wasn't the first." "No," James's voice was soft with sympathy, "but you may well be the last. I think it's time someone had a word with them about their practices." Something in his tone suggested this word would be rather more forceful than mere conversation. Sarah found herself oddly touched by his anger on her behalf. "The thing is," she said, forcing herself to maintain composure, "I'm not without skills. I have my teaching certificate, references from the school board. I'm good with numbers. I managed all the school's accounts. I need time to find my feet." James set down the letter, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Winters, I'm about to speak very plainly, if you'll permit me." At her nod, he continued. Silver Creek Ranch is prosperous, but it's growing faster than we can keep up with. We need someone with education, someone who understands bookkeeping and organization. The town needs a teacher desperately. Children are growing up unable to read simply because there's no one qualified to teach them. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. I'm not offering marriage. That would be inappropriate given your situation, but I am offering you a position. Stay here, help with the ranch's books, teach in town when the school term starts, give yourself time to heal and decide what you truly want from life. Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would do that? For a complete stranger? You're hardly a stranger anymore, James smiled. And yes, I would, though I confess it's not entirely altruistic. Your skills are valuable, Miss Winters. I'm offering you a fair wage for honest work. The practicality of his offer steadied her. This wasn't charity, it was business, with clear terms and expectations. Yet there was something more in his eyes, something that suggested he saw beyond mere business arrangements. I accept, Sarah said quietly, and please call me Sarah. Sarah. He tested the name, his voice warming it like sunlight on honey. Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch, properly this time. Mrs. Bennet, who had been suspiciously busy with the coffee pot during this exchange, finally allowed herself to beam. Well, then that's settled. More breakfast, anyone? Sarah found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since receiving that devastating letter. Outside the window, the sun had fully cleared the horizon, painting the world in shades of promise and possibility. In her mind, she could already see herself writing in that little journal, recording not the end of her dreams, but their unexpected transformation into something new, and perhaps even better. James caught her eye across the table, and in that moment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, she was exactly where she needed to be. After breakfast, James spread a hand-drawn map across his study's massive oak desk. The parchment was weathered but meticulously maintained, its careful annotations speaking of years of thoughtful stewardship. Sarah stood beside him, close enough to catch the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to his clothing. Silver Creek Ranch proper, he explained, his finger tracing the boundaries, runs from the creek here to the foothills there, about 40,000 acres, though we lease grazing rights on another 20,000 from the territory. His voice carried equal measures of pride and responsibility. This section here is where we're having trouble with the Harristons. Sarah leaned closer, studying the area he indicated. Trouble. They've been allowing their cattle to graze on our land, claiming the boundary markers were moved. James's jaw tightened. It's nonsense, of course. The markers have stood in the same place since my grandfather's time, but they're desperate, and desperate people can be dangerous. The morning sun, streaming through the study windows, caught the silver threading through James's dark hair at the temples. It suited him, Sarah thought, adding gravity to his bearing without diminishing his vital energy. Now, he continued, reaching for another map, this shows our water rights. Critical out here, more valuable than gold in a dry season. He paused, glancing at her. I'm not boring you, am I? Sarah shook her head emphatically. No, it's fascinating. In Vermont, we thought of ranching as simply raising cattle. I never realized how complex the legal and territorial aspects could be. A pleased expression crossed James's face. Most people don't. They see the romantic side, cowboys and cattle drives. They don't see the contracts, the water rights, the endless negotiations with neighbors and territory officials. Is that why you need help with the books? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Partly. James rolled the maps carefully, securing them with leather ties. The ranch has grown significantly in the past 5 years. We've added new breeding programs, expanded our grazing lands, invested in better stock. The paperwork, he smiled ruefully. Well, let's just say I'd rather be in the saddle than behind a desk. A knock at the study door interrupted them. Pete, the foreman James had mentioned the night before, stood in the doorway. He was a weathered man of indeterminate age, with kind eyes and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "Boss," he nodded to James, then touched his hat respectfully to Sarah. "Miss Winters, thought you might like to see some of the operation, if you're feeling up to it." James glanced at Sarah questioningly. She straightened her spine, determined to show her willingness to learn. "I'd love to." Mrs. Bennet appeared as if by magic, with a warm coat that fit Sarah surprisingly well. "Used to belong to James's sister," the housekeeper explained, helping her into it. "She lives in Denver now, married to a banker." There was a wealth of unspoken history in those few words. The morning air was crisp, but not bitter, the sun having taken the worst edge off the night's cold. Pete led them first to the horse barn, where Sarah met Tom, the young horse trainer. His face lit up when James mentioned Sarah's teaching background. "My sister's got 3 little ones," Tom said eagerly. "Been wanting proper schooling, something fierce. Nearest school's 20 miles away, too far for daily travel. We've got a schoolhouse in town," James explained to Sarah. "Built it 2 years ago, but finding a teacher willing to come this far west," he let the sentence trail off meaningfully. The tour continued to the cattle pens, where Sarah learned more about animal husbandry than she'd ever expected to know. Pete proved to be a natural teacher, explaining complex concepts in clear, practical terms. "See how that heifer holds herself?" he pointed. "Gonna calve within the week, I'd warrant. We've got special pens for the mothers, keep them safe from predators during birthing." Sarah found herself taking mental notes, already thinking about how to organize this information for future reference. Her attention was drawn to a group of men working with what appeared to be new cattle. "Bringing in fresh bloodlines," James explained, following her gaze. "Bought these Herefords from a breeder in Kansas. Cost a pretty penny, but they'll improve our whole herd. That's why the books are so important now," Pete added. "Used to be we could keep track of everything in our heads. Now, with all these breeding programs and bloodlines," he shook his head, "need proper records." They were interrupted by a rider approaching at a gallop. The man reined in sharply, his horse throwing up clods of snow. "Mr. Montgomery!" The rider's voice was urgent. "Harriston men are moving cattle onto the north pasture again. They've got guns this time." James's expression hardened. "Pete, get the men together. Miss Winters, I apologize, but—" "Go," Sarah said firmly. "I can find my way back to the house." He caught her hand, squeezing it briefly. "We'll continue this tour later. Pete, make sure Miss Winters gets back safely before you join us." Sarah watched them ride out, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. The morning's peaceful routine had been shattered, revealing the very real dangers that lurked beneath the surface of ranch life. Back in the house, she found Mrs. Bennet in the kitchen, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Harriston's causing trouble again." At Sarah's nod, she sighed. "Been getting worse lately. James won't say it, but I think they're trying to force him to buy them out at an inflated price. By threatening his cattle." Sarah was appalled. "By threatening everything." Mrs. Bennet's voice was grim. "They're desperate, and desperate folks can justify all sorts of things to themselves." Sarah spent the next few hours trying to distract herself by examining the ranch's account books, which she found in James's study. The complexity of the operation became even clearer as she pored over the records. Equipment purchases, cattle, sales, payroll for the ranch hands, breeding program investments, all meticulously recorded, but in a system that had clearly evolved organically rather than being properly organized from the start. It was nearly sunset when she heard horses in the yard. Looking out the study window, she saw James dismounting, his movements betraying fatigue but no injury. The knot in her stomach loosened slightly. When he found her in the study, his eyebrows rose at the sight of the open books. "Making yourself at home? I hope you don't mind," Sarah gestured to her notes. "I thought I might as well make a start on understanding the systems you're using." "Mind?" James smiled. some of the tension leaving his face. "Sarah, you're already proving yourself invaluable." He crossed to warm his hands at the fire. "We got the situation resolved for now. No shots fired, thank God." But he turned to face her, his expression serious. "I want you to be aware of what you're getting into here. This isn't just about books and teaching. The Harristons are becoming a real threat, and staying here puts you in the middle of it." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Montgomery, James, after what they did to me and others like me, I think I'm already in the middle of it. At least here, I'm facing it honestly, with people I'm coming to trust." Something flickered in his eyes at her words. He took a step toward her, then seemed to catch himself. "Well then," he said softly, "welcome to the fight, Miss Winters." The old account book spoke to Sarah in a language she understood intimately. After a week at Silver Creek Ranch, she had commandeered a corner of James's study, surrounding herself with ledgers and papers. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching dust motes that danced above the stacked volumes of ranch records. "James," she called out, not looking up from a particularly puzzling entry. "Did you know you're losing nearly 8% of your profits to inefficient feed? Purchasing?" He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his riding clothes from the morning's work. "I suspected something wasn't right there, but I couldn't pin it down." Sarah spread several ledgers across the desk. "Look here. You're buying feed from 3 different suppliers, all at different rates. If you consolidated the purchases and negotiated a bulk rate," she did some quick calculations on a scratch pad, "you could save enough to cover the new breeding program costs." James leaned over her shoulder, studying the figures. His presence was distracting in a way Sarah tried not to examine too closely. "This is remarkable," he said softly. "You found in a week what we've been missing for years." "It's just a matter of organization," Sarah demurred, though pleasure warmed her cheeks. "In the school, we had to account for every penny. I learned to look for patterns, inefficiencies. Patterns like this." He pulled another ledger from the stack, opening it to a marked page. "I've been wondering about our cattle sales timing." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. If you adjusted your sales schedule to align with the Kansas City market peaks." She reached for the relevant documents, her hand brushing against his. Both of them paused for a moment, the contact sending an unexpected thrill through her arm. "Mr. Montgomery," Pete's voice from the hallway broke the moment. "Got those breeding records you wanted?" James straightened, putting a proper distance between them as Pete entered. The foreman's eyes took in the scene. The spread papers, Sarah's flushed face, James's slightly awkward stance, but he merely handed over the documents with a knowing smile. "Miss Winters has been showing me some interesting findings," James said, his voice carefully professional. "It seems we've been less than efficient in our operations." Pete's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Don't surprise me none. Been telling you for years we needed someone with a proper head for numbers." He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Looks like we found her." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of productive work. Sarah created a new organizational system for the breeding records, cross-referencing bloodlines and health histories in a way that made the information instantly accessible. She was so engrossed that she barely noticed the lengthening shadows until Mrs. Bennet appeared with a lamp and a tray of coffee. "You two have been at it for hours," the housekeeper chided gently. "Time to rest those eyes." Sarah sat back, suddenly aware of how stiff her shoulders had become. James, who had been working quietly at his own desk, rose to pour them both coffee. "I think we've earned this," he said, handing her a cup. "You've accomplished more in a week than I managed in a year of struggling with those books." "It helps that I love this kind of work," Sarah admitted. "At the school, the other teachers used to tease me about my passion for ledgers and organization. Their loss, our gain." James settled into a chair near her desk. "Sarah, I hope you know how valuable your contributions are already proving to be." The use of her given name, still rare enough to feel special, warmed her more than the coffee. "I'm glad to be useful," she said softly. After what happened with the Harristons, I needed to prove to myself that I had something genuine to offer. You have far more than that to offer. James's voice was low, intense. You have intelligence, insight, capability. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. The ranch isn't the only one benefiting from your presence. Before Sarah could respond to this charged statement, they heard the thunder of approaching hooves. James was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Riders," he said tersely, "coming in fast." Moments later, Tom burst into the study, his young face flushed with excitement and worry. "Mr. Montgomery, the Harristons, they're claiming we stole cattle from their north pasture. They're threatening to bring the law into it." James's expression hardened. "When?" "They say 3 days ago during that snowstorm." Tom twisted his hat in his hands. "But sir, that's when we were all working on the broken fence line in the south section. There wasn't anyone near their land." Sarah was already moving, pulling specific ledgers from her newly organized stacks. "Here," she said, spreading them. "Out. The work records, supply requisitions and daily logs. Everything's documented, which men were where, what they were doing, even how many fence posts were used." James studied the clear, detailed records with growing appreciation. "This is perfect. Documentation that would stand up in any court." He looked at Sarah with something like wonder. "You didn't just organize our books. You gave us a defense against exactly this kind of accusation." "I believe in being thorough," Sarah said, allowing herself a small smile of satisfaction. Tom was practically bouncing with relief. "Should I tell Pete to ride out and meet them, show them these records?" "No," James said thoughtfully. "Let them come to us. Sarah, would you be willing to present this evidence? I have a feeling the Harristons won't expect to face someone with your particular skills." Sarah squared her shoulders, feeling a surge of righteous anger toward the family that had wronged her and was now trying to harm the ranch that had given her sanctuary. "I would be honored." As Tom hurried out to relay the message, James turned to Sarah. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came west," he said quietly. "Becoming entangled in a range war wasn't part of the job description." "No," Sarah agreed, gathering the relevant documents with precise movements. "It's better. At least here I'm fighting for something worthwhile alongside people worth fighting for." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer merely employer and employee, no longer simply two people thrown together by circumstance. They were partners in a battle that had become personal for both of them. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Sarah lifted her chin, ready to face whatever came next. She had found her place, her purpose, and her power. The Harristons had no idea what they were about to encounter. The town of Silver Creek lay nestled in a valley 12 miles from the ranch, its wooden buildings and broad main street speaking of a settlement that had grown from rugged beginnings into something approaching civilization. Sarah sat beside James in the buggy, watching the town emerge from the morning mist like a painting slowly gaining detail. The local newspaper office caught her eye immediately. A modest building, with a freshly painted sign declaring it the Silver Creek Sentinel. Through the window, she could see the editor hunched over his desk, no doubt crafting the next edition's stories. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyebrows rising at the sight of a strange woman in James Montgomery's buggy. "Prepare yourself," James murmured, guiding the horses down the main street. "News travels fast in small towns, and you're about to become the most interesting story they've had in months." Sarah smoothed her skirts, grateful for Mrs. Bennet's loan of a fashionable blue dress that made her feel equal to any scrutiny. "The mysterious Eastern lady," she quoted from the newspaper article she'd glimpsed on James's desk that morning. He chuckled. "Already seen that, have you? Mr. Parker, the editor, has quite a way with words. Though in this case, he's not entirely wrong about the mystery. You've certainly brought some intrigue to our quiet corner of the territory." They pulled up in front of the general store, its windows displaying an eclectic mix of practical goods and modest luxuries. James helped Sarah down from the buggy, his hand lingering on hers, perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. She was acutely aware of the eyes watching from various windows and doorways. The store's bell chimed as they entered. Mrs. Miller, the proprietor's wife, looked up from her counter and nearly dropped the bolt of calico she was measuring. "Mr. Montgomery, what a pleasant surprise!" Her eyes fixed on Sarah with barely concealed curiosity. "And this must be Miss Sarah Winters," James introduced smoothly. "She's helping manage the ranch's accounts and will be teaching at the school when term begins." Sarah met Mrs. Miller's assessing gaze with quiet confidence. "I'm looking forward to becoming part of the community," she said warmly. "I understand there are quite a few children eager for proper schooling." Mrs. Miller's expression softened at the mention of children. "Oh, yes, indeed. My own Tommy's been pestering me about reading lessons. He's 7 now and bright as a new penny." She paused, her natural friendliness winning out over gossip-hungry curiosity. "Perhaps you'd like to see the school building while you're in town. I'd appreciate that very much." Sarah smiled. As Mrs. Miller gathered her shawl, the store's door opened again. A well-dressed woman entered, her elaborate hat marking her as someone who considered herself above mere frontier fashion. "James Montgomery," she trilled, "how wonderful to see you in town." "Mrs. Whitaker," James's greeting was polite but cooling. "I trust you're well." "Oh, quite well." Her sharp eyes fixed on Sarah. "And this must be the mysterious lady everyone's talking about. How interesting." Sarah felt James tense beside her. Before he could speak, she stepped forward with her most gracious schoolteacher's smile. "Sarah Winters, I'm afraid there's nothing very mysterious about me, unless you count my passion for proper bookkeeping and educational theory." Mrs. Whitaker blinked, clearly thrown by this matter-of-fact response. "Oh, I had heard, that is, there were rumors about my arrival at the station." Sarah's voice remained pleasant, but took on a subtle edge of steel. "A rather unfortunate situation with the Harrison family. I'm sure you've heard about their unusual business practices." Mrs. Whitaker's face changed. "The Harristons? Why, they tried the same thing with my niece last spring. Poor girl lost her entire savings." She caught herself, suddenly aware she was taking sides. "That is, well, it's not my place to gossip." "Of course not," Sarah agreed smoothly. "Though I'm sure Mr. Parker at the Sentinel would be interested in knowing there are other victims of their scheme. For the public good, you understand." James made a sound that might have been a hastily suppressed laugh. Mrs. Miller was beaming openly now, clearly delighted by Sarah's handling of the town's most notorious gossip. "Shall we see the school?" Mrs. Miller suggested brightly. "It's just past the church." The schoolhouse proved to be a solid building, with large windows and sturdy desks, though it clearly needed a woman's touch. Sarah was already making mental notes about books to order and improvements to suggest when she heard James speaking quietly with someone outside. Through the window, she saw him deep in conversation with a distinguished-looking man in a banker's suit. Their discussion seemed intense but not unfriendly. "That's Mr. Harrison from the bank," Mrs. Miller explained. "He's been after James to expand the ranch's operations for years. Says Silver Creek Ranch could be the biggest operation in the territory, with proper investment." Sarah absorbed this information thoughtfully. The ledgers had shown her the ranch's potential for growth, but also the risks involved in expanding too quickly. She wondered if James had been hesitating out of prudence, or lack of confidence in the ranch's organizational systems. When they rejoined James outside, his expression was preoccupied but pleased. "Mr. Harrison sends his compliments," he told Sarah, "and his hopes that you'll consider taking on the school board's treasury duties as well as teaching. Word of your financial acumen travels fast," Mrs. Miller laughed. "Though I'm not surprised. We haven't had anyone with proper Eastern education here since James's sister left for Denver." The mention of James's sister brought a flicker of something pain, regret to his face, but he covered it quickly. "We should see about those supplies we came for," he said. "Sarah, I believe you had a list?" The rest of the morning passed in a productive blur of purchases and introductions. Sarah met what felt like half the town, each encounter reinforcing her initial impression of a community hungry for education and refinement, but unwilling to sacrifice its frontier independence. As they loaded the last of their purchases into the buggy, Sarah caught sight of the Sentinel's latest edition being posted in the newspaper office window. Below a headline about cattle prices and territory politics was a smaller item, distinguished. Eastern Lady brings promise of education and culture to Silver Creek. Well, James said, following her gaze, it seems you've won them over. Sarah smiled, thinking of Mrs. Whitaker's discomfiture and Mrs. Miller's warm welcome. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough to make a start. More than a start, James corrected, helping her into the buggy. You handled them perfectly, especially Victoria Whitaker. I've never seen her so thoroughly and politely put in her place. As they drove out of town, Sarah found herself feeling oddly satisfied. She had faced the town's scrutiny and emerged victorious, transforming herself from an object of gossip into a respected professional in the space of a morning. You know, James said, as the town receded behind them, I think Silver Creek won't know what hit it once you really get started. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie wind. For the first time since leaving Vermont, she felt truly, completely free, not just from the Harristons' scheme, but from all the constraints and expectations that had shaped her old life. Here, she could be exactly who she was meant to be. The future stretched before her like the open road ahead, full of promise and possibility, and if she was starting to imagine that future with James Montgomery by her side, well, that was a mystery still unfolding. The telegram arrived on a crisp morning 2 weeks after the town visit. Sarah was reviewing the newly organized breeding records when she heard the rapid hoofbeats of the messenger's horse approaching. Through the study window, she watched James step out onto the porch to receive the message, his body language shifting subtly as he read its contents. Moments later, he appeared in the study doorway, the yellow paper crumpled slightly in his hand. The Harristons have made their move, he said without preamble. They've filed a formal complaint with the territory marshal. Cattle theft, water, rights violations, boundary disputes, everything they can think of. Sarah set down her pen, her heart quickening. But we have documentation proving otherwise. We do, thanks to you. James crossed to warm his hands at the fire, though Sarah suspected the gesture was more about gathering his thoughts than seeking warmth. The marshal's riding out tomorrow. Wants to see our records, inspect the boundary markers. Then we'll show him everything, Sarah said firmly. The work logs, the boundary surveys, the water rights dating back to your grandfather's time. James turned to face her, his expression troubled. It's not just about the documentation. The Harristons are desperate, Sarah, a desperate family with nothing left to lose. He let the thought hang unfinished. As if to underscore his words, Pete appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave. Boss, you're gonna want to see this. North pasture. They took the fastest horses, Sarah refusing to be left behind. She'd grown more comfortable in the saddle over the past weeks, though she knew her riding still betrayed her eastern upbringing. James kept his mount close to hers as they followed Pete along the fence line. The damage was obvious even from a distance. A section of fence lay scattered across the snow-dusted ground, the wire cut clean through in multiple places. But it was what lay beyond that made Sarah's blood run cold. A dozen or more cattle lay still in the snow, their valuable brands crudely altered. Poisoned, Pete said grimly, pointing to a contaminated water trough. Must have happened during the night, and look here. He indicated the mangled brands, trying to make it look like we were the ones stealing and rebranding. James dismounted to examine one of the brands more closely. Clumsy work, he muttered. No experienced rancher would believe this was done by professionals. But the marshal might not know that, Sarah realized, sliding carefully from her horse. If he's not familiar with proper ranching practices. Exactly, James straightened, his face hard with anger. "They're trying to muddy the waters, create doubt. Even if we prove our innocence, the accusations alone could damage our reputation. With the banks, the buyers." A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up snow near their feet. James moved with startling speed, pulling Sarah behind the shelter of a large boulder. Pete had already taken cover, his rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. "That came from the ridge," he said calmly, as though being shot at was a minor inconvenience. "Single shooter, probably just trying to scare us off." "Well, they succeeded," James said grimly. "We're heading back. Now." His arm was still around Sarah, holding her close against his side. She could feel his heart pounding, matching the rapid beat of her own. They made it back to their horses without further incident, but the message had been received. This was no longer just about legal claims and territory disputes. The Harristons had escalated to potentially deadly force. Back at the ranch house, Mrs. Bennet took one look at their faces and wordlessly brought coffee laced with something stronger. They gathered in James's study, James, Sarah, Pete, and Tom, who had ridden in from checking the other pastures. "Found 2 more places where they cut the fence," Tom reported. "No more dead cattle, but they left signs to make sure we knew they'd been there." "We need to bring in more men," Pete suggested. "Set up regular patrols." James nodded slowly. "I'll send word to some friends in the territory. Good men I've worked with before." He glanced at Sarah. "I'm sorry you're caught up in this." "Don't be," she said firmly. "I chose to stay, and now I'm going to help you fight." She reached for a fresh ledger. "First, we document everything. Every cut fence, every poisoned trough, every altered brand, times, dates, locations, all of it. When the marshal arrives, we'll have more than just our word against theirs." The others stared at her for a moment before James broke into a slow smile. "You're right, of course. Pete, Tom, I want every man keeping detailed notes of anything suspicious. Sarah will show you how to record it properly." As the men left to spread the word, James remained behind. He stood at the window, staring out at the gathering dusk. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Winters." "How so?" "Most women would be packing their bags after being shot at. You're organizing patrol records." Sarah moved to stand beside him. "Most women haven't had their dreams stolen by the Harristons, only to find something better." She hesitated, then added softly, "Something worth fighting for." He turned to face her, and suddenly the space between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. "Sarah," his voice was rough with emotion, "I never meant to bring danger into your life." "You brought purpose instead," she countered, "and hope, and—" She faltered, not quite ready to name the other feelings growing between them. A commotion outside broke the moment. More riders were arriving, ranch hands responding to Pete's call for extra help. James straightened, duty calling him back to his responsibilities. But before he left the study, he paused. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I'm grateful. You're here, not just for your skills with books and organization, but for everything you are." Sarah watched him stride out to meet the new arrivals, her heart full of complicated emotions. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere out there, the Harristons were plotting their next move. But here, in this house with these people, Sarah had found something worth any risk. She turned back to her ledgers, ready to create order from chaos, to build a defense against those who would destroy what she had come to love. The evening stretched ahead, full of work to be done, but she faced it with a fierce determination. She was no longer the abandoned bride on a desolate platform. She was Sarah Winters of Silver Creek Ranch, and she would not be driven away by fear or force. The old family Bible lay open on Mrs. Bennet's kitchen table, its pages worn smooth by generations of Montgomery hands. Sarah found herself drawn to it in the tense hours before dawn, seeking comfort in its familiar verses as she waited for a word from the men. James and most of the ranch hands had been out since midnight, responding to reports of massive cattle movement along the northern boundary. Mrs. Bennet set a cup of coffee beside her, the housekeeper's usual cheerful demeanor subdued. "James's mother used to read from that very page during troubled times," she said softly. "Said it helped her find clarity when things seemed darkest." Sarah's fingers traced the faded ink annotations in the margins, little notes and observations written by Montgomery hands long past. Did she face anything like this? Worse, in the early days. Mrs. Bennet settled into a chair across from her. This territory wasn't always as civilized as it is now, but she had faith in God, in her family, in the rightness of what they were building here. The distant sound of hooves interrupted their quiet conversation. Sarah was on her feet instantly, moving to the window. The pale light of approaching dawn revealed Tom riding hard toward the house, his horse lathered despite the cold. They met him on the porch, the young horse trainer's face tight with urgency. "Miss Winters, the Harristons. They're driving a huge herd through Potter's Gap. If they get those cattle across the creek, they'll contaminate our water supply," Sarah finished, her mind racing. The carefully organized maps in James's study had shown her how critical that water access was. "Where's James?" "Still up watching the north boundary with Pete and the others. The Harristons split our forces, made us think they were coming that way, then sent their main drive through the gap." Sarah's teaching background had taught her to think quickly, to adapt when lessons went awry. "Tom, ride to town. Get Marshal Davies. He needs to see this." "Mrs. Bennet, send one of the houseboys to alert James." She was already moving toward the barn. "I'll try to slow them down until help arrives." "Miss Winters," Mrs. Bennet's voice was sharp with concern. "You can't." "I can and I must." Sarah swung herself onto her mare, grateful now for all the riding practice of recent weeks. "I won't engage them directly, but I know something they don't." The ride to Potter's Gap took 15 agonizing minutes, even pushing her horse to its limits. The sound of the cattle drive reached her before she could see it. Hundreds of animals being pushed too hard by desperate men. She reined in on a rise overlooking the gap just as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. The Harriston plan became clear at once. They were driving the cattle toward the creek crossing, where the water ran shallow this time of year. Once across, they'd claimed the animals had always been on their range. With brands altered and boundaries disputed, it would be their word against Silver Creeks. But Sarah had spent hours studying the ranch records, including the territory water rights laws. She knew exactly where the legal boundaries lay, and more importantly, she knew about the old dam. Turning her horse, she galloped for the creek's upper reach. The mechanism was exactly where the maps had shown it, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. The lever was stiff with disuse, but Sarah's determination lent her strength. With a grinding sound, the ancient sluice gate began to rise. The creek wasn't large, but generations of Montgomerys had engineered it carefully. Within minutes, the water level at the crossing began to rise, transforming the easy ford into a dangerous torrent. She heard shouts of confusion and anger from the gap as the Harriston crew discovered their path blocked. From her vantage point, Sarah could see them milling in confusion, unable to force the cattle through the suddenly swollen creek. The sound of more riders approaching sent her heart racing until she recognized James's dark stallion in the lead. He reined in beside her, taking in the scene with a mix of surprise and admiration. "The maps," he said, understanding dawning. "You remembered the dam." "Knowledge is power," Sarah quoted her old school principle, "though I never expected to apply that lesson quite like this." More hooves thundered up the trail. Marshal Davies and his deputies, led by Tom. The lawman took one look at the blocked cattle drive and the rising creek, and shook his head. Well, well," he drawled. "Seems we've caught someone moving an awful lot of cattle awful early in the morning." He squinted at the herd, and unless my eyes deceive me, those brands don't look quite right. The confrontation that followed was almost anticlimactic. The Harriston crew, faced with armed deputies and clear evidence of their wrongdoing, surrendered without violence. By mid-morning, The marshal was examining the altered brands while his deputies took statements. "You'll have to testify," James told Sarah quietly as they watched the proceedings. "About the records, the patterns of harassment. All of it. Good." She met his gaze steadily. "It's time someone stood up to them properly." He studied her face for a long moment. "You know, when I found you at that station, I thought I was rescuing you." A smile touched his lips. "Turns out you're the one saving us." "We're saving each other," Sarah corrected softly. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and her heart turned over at the tenderness in his expression. Marshal Davies approached, pocketing his notebook. "Miss Winters, that was quick thinking with the dam, though I hope you know they'll be out for blood now. The Harristons don't take defeat gracefully." "Let them come," James said, his voice hard. "We'll be ready." His hand found Sarah's, squeezing gently. "All of us." Later that evening, after the excitement had died down, and the ranch had settled into an uneasy calm, Sarah returned to the kitchen. The Bible still lay open where she'd left it that morning, but now, looking at the familiar words of comfort and strength, she saw them differently. Faith, she realized, wasn't just about believing in divine providence. It was about believing in oneself, in the people who stood beside you, in the rightness of your cause. She had lost her faith briefly on that cold station platform, but here at Silver Creek Ranch, she had found it again, stronger and deeper than before. Mrs. Bennett found her there, tears running silently down her cheeks. Without a word, the housekeeper wrapped her in a warm embrace. "Welcome home, child," she whispered. "Welcome home." The old photograph lay forgotten in a drawer until Sarah found it while reorganizing James's study one quiet afternoon. Sepia-toned faces gazed out from the past. A younger James, a lovely woman who had to be his sister, and two older people who could only be his parents. They stood proudly before the ranch house, which looked smaller than its current size, but no less grand. "That was taken 6 years ago," James's voice came from behind her, making her start. "The last time we were all together." Sarah turned, apology ready on her lips for prying, but his expression held no reproach. Instead, he crossed to stand beside her, gently taking the photograph from her hands. "My sister Claire," he said softly, indicating the young woman. "She was so full of life, of dreams, rather like you in that way." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She married a banker from Denver. Good man, treated her well. But my father, he took it hard. Felt like she was abandoning the ranch, everything he'd built." "And your mother?" Sarah asked gently, noting the elegant woman with James's same quiet dignity. "Gone 2 years now." His voice roughened. "She caught fever during a harsh winter. Father, he was never the same after that. Started making risky decisions, trying to expand too fast. When he died last year, he left the ranch deep in debt." Sarah's heart ached at the pain beneath his measured words. "That's why you've been hesitant about the bank's offers to finance expansion." "Yes." He set the photograph on his desk, his fingers lingering on the edges. "I spent a year digging us out of that hole, learning to trust my own judgment. The ranch is profitable again, stable. But sometimes I wonder if I'm too cautious now. Too afraid of repeating his mistakes. Is that why you haven't visited your sister?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. James's eyes met hers, surprised and perhaps a little defensive. "How did you—" "Mrs. Bennett mentioned it, and there are no recent letters from Denver in your correspondence files." She touched his arm gently. "James, I'm not judging. Family wounds run deep. I understand that better than most." He moved to the window, staring out at the land his family had shaped across generations. "Claire writes, every month like clockwork. Invites me to visit, to meet her children. I have a niece and nephew I've never seen." His shoulders sagged slightly. "But going to Denver, seeing her living that city life, it feels like admitting Father was wrong about everything." "Was he?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Your sister found her path, just as you found yours. The ranch survived, thrived even, because you were strong enough to learn from his mistakes instead of repeating them." And now, he turned to face her, something vulnerable in his expression. Am I making new mistakes, letting the Harristons push us around, hesitating to expand when the opportunity's there? No, Sarah said firmly. You're being wise, methodical. Look at these. She pulled out the ledgers she'd been working on. The ranch's growth under your management has been steady, sustainable. You've built something that will last. He studied. The neat columns of figures, the careful projections she'd drawn up. You've brought such clarity to everything, he said quietly. Not just the books, but I can see the path forward now. The ranch's future. There was something in his voice that made Sarah's heart beat faster. And what do you see in that future? Their eyes met, the moment charged with unspoken feelings. James took a step toward her, then stopped as boots sounded in the hallway. Pete appeared in the doorway, his expression apologetic. Sorry to interrupt. Boss, but we've got visitors. Harriston's lawyer and, well, you'd better come see. James straightened, duty calling him back. But before he left, he turned to Sarah. Would you help me write to Claire? I think it's time I met my niece and nephew. Of course, Sarah smiled, her heart full. Family is too precious to waste. Yes, he agreed softly, his eyes holding hers. Yes, it is. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the study, looking at the photograph still lying on the desk. The faces of James's family seemed to watch her with new understanding. She thought of her own family back east. Good people, but never quite understanding her dreams of something more. Here, in this room filled with the weight of history and the promise of the future, Sarah finally understood what she'd been seeking all along. Not just a new start or a position of respect, but a place to belong, people to care for, a legacy to help build. Mrs. Bennet found her there sometime later, still lost in thought. The housekeeper took one look at the photograph and the expression on Sarah's face and nodded knowingly. About time he shared that with someone, she said, settling into a chair. You know, I've been here since James was a boy. Watched him grow, up, become the man he is. Watched him shoulder the weight of this place all alone after his father died. She pinned Sarah with a shrewd look. He's different since you came. Lighter somehow, even with all this trouble brewing. He's a good man, Sarah said softly. He deserves to be happy. So do you, child. Mrs. Bennet rose, patting Sarah's hand. So do you, and maybe, she glanced meaningfully at the photograph, maybe there's room for a new family portrait. One of these days. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, James returned. His expression was troubled, but it softened when he saw her. The Harristons' lawyer brought papers, he explained, running a hand through his hair. They're challenging everything. Water rights, boundaries, even my father's original claims to some of the land. Then we'll fight them, Sarah said firmly, with every record, every document, every proof we have. And then, she hesitated, then pressed on. And then maybe we should take a trip to Denver. Show your sister that Silver Creek Ranch is strong, enough to survive its children finding their own paths. James stared at her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his face. How do you always know exactly what needs to be said? Perhaps because I'm learning to see clearly too, she answered softly, to understand what matters most. The photograph on the desk caught the late afternoon sun, the faces of the past bearing witness to this moment of understanding between them. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythm of work and purpose. But here in the quiet study, something was shifting, healing, beginning. Sarah thought of that cold night at the station, of all the twists of fate that had brought her here. Sometimes, she realized, what seems like an ending is really just the first step on a path you were always meant to find. The church quilting circle had never seen anything quite like the pattern Sarah suggested. As the ladies gathered around Mrs. Miller's table, their eyes wide with appreciation, Sarah traced the intricate design she'd brought from Vermont, a traditional pattern with her own mathematical precision applied to its angles and proportions. It's not just decorative, she explained, pointing to the symbolic elements woven into the design. See here, these lines represent Silver Creek itself, and these shapes echo the ranch boundaries. It's a map of our community, rendered in fabric and thread. Mrs. Whitaker, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters since their first encounter, leaned forward eagerly. "And you say each family could contribute a piece?" "Exactly." Sarah smiled, remembering similar projects from her teaching days. Each section representing a different part of our community, all joined together in harmony. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. In the month since the confrontation with the Harristons, the town had drawn together in support of Silver Creek Ranch. The quilt would be a tangible representation of that unity. The door chimed as James stepped into the shop, his imposing figure somewhat softened by the domestic scene before him. "Ladies," he greeted them, tipping his hat. "Sarah, when you have a moment." She could read the urgency in his stance, though. His tone remained casual. Excusing herself from the quilting circle, she joined him by the window. "The school board's called an emergency meeting," he said quietly. "They've received more applications for enrollment than anyone expected. They're talking about postponing the opening." Sarah's heart sank. She'd been working for weeks to prepare the schoolhouse, ordering books, developing lesson plans. How many additional students? 15? Maybe 20? Words spread through the territory about a proper Eastern-educated teacher coming to Silver Creek. His eyes held a mix of pride and concern. They're worried about space, resources. "No." Sarah's teacher's voice emerged, the tone that had quelled unruly classrooms in Vermont. "We're not postponing. Those children have waited long enough for an education." She turned back to the quilting circle. "Ladies, I believe we've just found our first community project." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that transformed Silver Creek. The ladies of the quilting circle became an army of organizers, rallying their husbands and sons to help expand the schoolhouse. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, coordinating efforts with the same precision she'd brought to the ranch's books. James watched it unfold with quiet amazement. "You've given them a mission," he observed one evening as they rode back to the ranch after another planning meeting. "Something to unite around." "They were always united," Sarah corrected gently. "They just needed a reminder of what they could accomplish together." The schoolhouse expansion became a symbol of everything Silver Creek could be. Men who had been bitter rivals worked side by side, their wives keeping them fed and organized. Even Mrs. Whitaker's social influence proved invaluable, securing donations of books and supplies from her wealthy Denver connections. Through it all, the quilt grew, piece by piece. Each family contributed fabric, often with deeply personal meaning, a scrap from a wedding dress, a snippet from a child's first blanket. Sarah worked their stories into the overall design, creating something that was part art, part history, and part prophecy of the community's intertwined future. The morning they hung the completed quilt in the expanded schoolhouse, Sarah stood back to admire the effect. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, caught the careful stitching, making the creek pattern seem to flow like real water through the fabric. "It's quite something," James's voice came from behind her. He'd been in constant support through all of this, though she knew the ranch demanded most of his attention. "Like a map of belonging." "That's exactly what it is." Sarah turned to face him, struck again by the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. A reminder that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Sarah, But whatever he might have said was interrupted by the arrival of the first students and their parents, eager to see the improved schoolhouse. Sarah spent the next hour greeting families, learning names, assessing reading levels. She was in her element, and she could feel James watching her with something like wonder. Later, as the excited families dispersed and the autumn sun began to set, Sarah found herself alone again with the quilt. Her fingers traced the section that represented Silver Creek Ranch, the largest property in the area, yet now clearly part of a greater whole. "You've done something remarkable here," Mrs. Bennet said, appearing beside her. The housekeeper had come to town to help with the final preparations. You've shown them what's possible when they work together. We've done it, Sarah corrected. All of us. She thought of that frightened woman on the station platform, thinking her world had ended. How could she have known that it was only beginning? That what seemed like rejection would lead her to not just a home, but a community? That in learning to belong, she would help others find their own sense of belonging. The quilt caught the last rays of sunlight, its carefully pieced sections glowing like stained glass. In its intricate pattern, Sarah could read the future of Silver Creek, not just as a town, but as a family of families, bound together by choice and purpose and love. And if her heart beat a little faster when she traced the section where the ranch's boundaries met the town's edges, well, that was a hope she was learning to embrace, one careful stitch at a time. The storm struck without warning, a howling beast of wind and ice that turned the world white. Sarah stood at the study window, clutching her mother's silver locket, watching the temperature plummet as the blizzard raged. Somewhere out there, James and his men were trying to save the herd. They should have been back by now, Mrs. Bennet fretted, adding another log to the fire. The old ranch house creaked under the assault of the wind, its timbers protesting the savage cold. Sarah's fingers tightened around the locket until its edges bit into her palm. The small piece of jewelry was her last tie to her old life, but right now it felt like a frozen thing, as cold as the fear in her heart. Pete had ridden out at dawn to warn them about the weather turning. By then, James and a small crew were already moving cattle from the high pastures, trying to get them to sheltered ground before the storm hit. That had been hours ago. A shape emerged from the whiteout conditions. A rider, then another, their forms ghost-like in the swirling snow. Sarah was moving before she could think, throwing on her coat as she rushed to the door. James practically fell from his horse, his clothes frozen stiff. Sarah caught him, helping him toward the house, while ranch hands took care of the exhausted mounts. "The herd," he managed through chattering teeth as they got him inside. "Most safe, but there's still some trapped. North Ridge." "Don't you dare," Sarah said firmly, recognizing the look in his eyes. "You'll freeze to death if you go. Back out there." His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Can't leave them. My responsibility." "Our responsibility," Sarah corrected, helping him remove his frozen coat. "And we'll face it together, with clear heads and proper planning." Mrs. Bennet appeared with hot coffee and blankets, her practical nature taking over. "Miss Winters is right. You're no good to anyone frozen solid." Over the next hour, as feeling returned to James's extremities, Sarah assembled what they knew. 40 head of valuable breeding stock were still unaccounted for, trapped somewhere along the North Ridge. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the storm showed no signs of abating. "The old line shack," Sarah said suddenly, spreading out the ranch map. "The one your grandfather built. Could they have found shelter there?" James leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "It's possible. It's right about where we lost track of them." He studied her face. "But reaching it in this storm. We'll need supplies, ropes to string between riders so no one gets separated." Sarah was already making lists, her teacher's planning skills turning to survival logistics. "Maintenance records show the shack was stocked with emergency provisions last fall." James caught her hand, stilling her writing. "Sarah, I can't ask my men to risk this. I'll have to go alone." "You're not asking. I'm telling." She met his gaze steadily. "You taught me that ranching is about more than cattle. It's about people working together, trusting each other. So trust us now." The rescue party set out an hour later. James, Pete, Tom, and 2 of the strongest hands, all tied together with ropes, loaded with supplies. Sarah watched them disappear into the white void, her mother's locket now warm from her constant grip. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She kept the fires burning, helped Mrs. Bennet prepare food and medical supplies for their return, and prayed with a intensity she hadn't felt since that night at the station. When the first rope pulls signaled their return, Sarah thought her heart would burst. They'd found the cattle, safe in the old line shack, just as she'd guessed. Not a single animal lost. Though the same couldn't be said for James's favorite hat, sacrificed somewhere to the storm's fury. Later, after everyone was safe and warm, James found her in the study. She stood by the window, watching the storm rage itself out against the sturdy walls of their home. "You know," he said softly, "I always thought running this ranch was a solo endeavor, something I had to prove I could do alone." Sarah turned to face him, understanding in her eyes. "Some burdens are too heavy for one person. That's why we find partners to share them with." "Partners," he repeated, the word carrying a weight of meaning beyond their current situation. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside, something warm and certain was blooming between them, stronger than any storm. Spring came early to Silver Creek Ranch, painting the hills with the first tender green of new grass. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, when she heard James's familiar footsteps behind her. "I've been carrying something," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Something that belonged to my mother." Sarah turned, her breath catching at the sight of the small gold ring in his palm. It was a simple design, elegant and timeless, worn smooth by years of love. "She gave it to me before she died," James continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Said I'd know when it was time to pass it on. When I found someone who understood that ranching isn't just about the land or the cattle, it's about building something lasting, something bigger than ourselves." He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "That night at the station, I thought I was rescuing you. Instead, you saved all of us, the ranch, the school, the whole community. But most of all, you saved me from becoming a man who'd forgotten how to trust, how to hope." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as James went down on one knee, still holding her hand. "Sarah Winters, I'm not offering you a position anymore. I'm offering you a partnership in every sense of the word. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, filled with all the promise of their shared future. Sarah looked at the man before her, strong, honorable, and now wonderfully vulnerable, and knew with absolute certainty that this was what she'd been seeking all along, though she hadn't known it when she first came west. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes, with all my heart." The ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her. James stood, drawing her into his arms, and their first kiss tasted of joy and promise and the sweet certainty of coming home. From somewhere inside the house came the sound of muffled cheering. They broke apart to find Mrs. Bennett, Pete, and several others watching through the window, their faces beaming with approval. "About time," Pete called out, making Sarah laugh, and James shake his head with fond exasperation. Under the deepening twilight sky, with the ranch spread out before them and their family of choice celebrating behind them, Sarah felt the last pieces of her life fall perfectly into place. This was her true destiny, not a mail-order bride abandoned by strangers, but a woman who had found her own path to love, purpose, and belonging. "Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery," James whispered, and kissed her again. The wedding invitation lay on Sarah's desk, the ink still drying. Her careful copperplate handwriting flowed across the cream-colored paper. "James Montgomery and Sarah Winters request the honor of your presence." She smiled as she wrote Claire's name on the first envelope, knowing how much it meant to James to have his sister return to Silver Creek Ranch. "That's beautiful penmanship," James said from the doorway, his voice warm with admiration, "though I'm more interested in the part where you become Mrs. Montgomery." Sarah looked up to find him holding a stack of papers, the bank's final approval for the ranch expansion they'd planned together. With their marriage approaching, they'd decided to embrace growth while maintaining the careful management that had become their hallmark. "Mr. Harrison was quite impressed with our proposal," James continued, settling into the chair beside her desk. "Said he'd never seen such thorough planning." "Well, we're building for the future now," Sarah replied, her hand unconsciously touching her mother's locket, which these days held a tiny sketch of the ranch house rather than her old family portrait. Our future. The spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers through the open window, and with it the sounds of construction from the schoolhouse. The town had insisted on adding a new wing in honor of their wedding, ensuring room for generations of future students. Our future, James echoed softly, reaching for her hand. I like the sound of that. Outside, Silver Creek Ranch stretched toward the horizon, promising not just a marriage of hearts, but a legacy they would build together, one careful plan at a time. The white lace veil shimmered in the candlelight as Mrs. Bennet laid it carefully across Sarah's bed. I wore this at my own wedding, the housekeeper said softly, smoothing the delicate fabric. And James's mother wore it before me. Now it's your turn. Sarah touched the veil reverently, feeling the history woven into its intricate patterns. Through the window of her soon-to-be former room, she could see lights glowing in the windows of the bunkhouse, where James was spending his last night as a bachelor, following tradition despite his protests at being separated from her. Did you ever imagine, she asked Mrs. Bennet, that night when he brought me in from the cold, that we'd end up here? The older woman's eyes twinkled. Oh, I had my hopes. The way he looked at you even then, though I don't think either of you were ready to see it yet. From downstairs came the sound of Claire's laughter, mingling with the voices of the quilting circle ladies who had gathered to help with the final wedding preparations. The ranch house was filled with warmth and joy, so different from that cold, desperate night at the station. Tomorrow, Sarah whispered, touching the veil once more. Everything changes. No, dear, Mrs. Bennet corrected gently. Everything becomes what it was always meant to be. The marriage certificate waited on the church altar, its pristine surface ready to record the most important moment of their lives. Sarah stood in the small antechamber, Mrs. Bennet's veil flowing around her shoulders, listening to the gentle murmur of guests filling the church. Through the doorway, she caught glimpses of their world coming together. Ranch hands in their Sunday best, townspeople in their finest clothes, Claire's children scattering flower petals with solemn concentration. The community quilt had been hung behind the altar, its intricate pattern now including a special panel commemorating this day. Pete appeared at her side, offering his arm. After learning that Sarah's father couldn't make the long journey from Vermont, the foreman had shyly offered to give her away. "Ready, Miss Winters?" he asked, his weathered face beaming. "For the last time I'll call you that." The wedding march began, and Sarah stepped into the church on Pete's arm. But her eyes were fixed on James, waiting for her at the altar. He stood tall and proud in his best suit, his face transformed by joy as he saw her. As they spoke their vows beneath the quilt that symbolized their community, Sarah felt the rightness of every step that had led her here. The certificate would record their union in ink and paper, but their hearts had been joined long before, in quiet moments of partnership, trust, and growing love. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. And as James kissed her, Sarah knew she had found not just a husband, but a true partner in all things. The house keys jingled softly in Sarah's hand as she unlocked the newly expanded ranch office. Morning light streaming through windows that overlooked both the school in the distance and the grazing herds beyond. 6 months into their marriage, Silver Creek Ranch had flourished under their joint leadership. Mrs. Montgomery, James's voice, carried a note of pride that still made her heart flutter. "The cattle buyers from Kansas City are impressed with our breeding program records. They're offering exclusive contracts." Sarah smiled as she reviewed the meticulously kept books that had helped transform the ranch. The Harristons had quietly sold their failing property and moved east, their threats forgotten in the face of Silver Creek's rising prosperity. Under the joint management of James and Sarah Montgomery, the ranch had become a model of modern operation, blending traditional ranching with careful planning and community involvement. "You know," James said, wrapping his arms around her waist, "I never gave you a proper tour of the north pasture where we're expanding." "Is that so, Mr. Montgomery?" Sarah leaned back against him, savoring their shared joy in both business and pleasure. Perhaps we should remedy that. As they rode out together, Sarah thought of that cold night at the station, realizing that sometimes the end of one dream simply opens the door to a better one. One you didn't even know your heart was seeking. 1 year to the day after that fateful night at the station, the photographer from Denver carefully positioned his camera in front of the ranch house. The morning sun caught the silver threading through James's hair as he stood proudly beside Sarah, their first family portrait capturing far more than just their image. Behind them, the expanded ranch house stood as a testament to their success. New wings added thoughtfully, the garden Sarah had planted blooming with promise. Through the open door, Mrs. Bennet could be seen arranging flowers, while Pete and the ranch hands gathered nearby, all part of the extended family they'd built together. "Hold still now," the photographer instructed, but he needn't have worried. Sarah and James stood naturally close, their comfort with each other evident in every shared glance. Her hand rested over her heart, where beneath her dress lay a small locket containing 2 pictures now. Her past in Vermont on one side, and on the other, the image of the station platform where their story began. The ranch stretched out behind them, cattle dotting the distant hills, the school bell ringing in the distance. Silver Creek had grown into everything they'd dreamed of and more. Their love story had not ended with "I do," but had instead blossomed into a partnership that touched every life around them. "Beautiful," the photographer declared, capturing forever the moment when Sarah and James Montgomery stood before their home, their hearts as united as their lives, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a midnight rescue and end with a legacy built on faith, trust, and the courage to believe in second chances.